C.R. Wiley, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, Will, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for asking.
I listened to your book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos, on audiobook a couple weeks ago, and I just found it to be an incredibly moving work that I think speaks to the heart of what many men are asking about and thinking about, both in the men's movement as a whole, the quote unquote manosphere, but then also in many of the Christian men I talk to, like, what is this really all about? And I know you've spoken very movingly about your past on other podcasts, so we'll skip past all that because I really just want to start digging into the notion of what it means to be a householder, what the household is. But let's start in talking about the cosmos, which I think is a word that we don't really have a great understanding of today, and that you broke it down so marvelously in the book.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk about that. I want me to just kind of launch into it.
Yeah, please jump on in.
Sure. Well, I think, when we hear the word cosmos, we think about, the PBS television shows,
Sure.
and we think about outer space and stuff like that. But that's a fairly, contemporary modern use of the term or the word. Um, the word that we translate into the English word world in the Bible is actually cosmos. And that's often lost on folks. But the meaning behind it is not so much that we are referring to a place, although it includes that, but an order of things. That's
Mm-hmm.
really the fundamental concept. So there is a kind of reality in which we dwell, and we have to be in some sense harmony with it. If we're not, then we're the ones who suffer, not the cosmos.
Right.
So now, what's happened because of kind of advances in our ability to measure things and see things far away is we see that the physical universe is much larger than we knew. But even our ancestors knew it was a very, very large thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they understood that the physical sort of arrangements had a kind of corresponding spiritual I guess, significance. And so, even when we think about prepositions, like when we think about the fact that we can't really talk about anything of value or meaning without referring to up and down, time past, time in the future, things like that. It gives us such a sense that we still live in a meaningful universe that we have to refer to in order to make sense of things. So, for example,
Right.
if I were to say, I really look up to him. Well, does
Mm-hmm.
that mean I'm literally looking up to the guy? Is he
Right.
just a lot taller than me? No, we're,
Sure.
we're saying something about his moral stature or his achievements and stuff like that. So when we think about, for example, how the universe is ordered, the cosmos is ordered, it's ordered vertically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we think about the kind of the emphasis that we have in the world today, we think about the horizontal. Everybody's supposed to be
Right.
equal. No one's supposed to be more important than anybody else, that kind of thing. But we all know deep down inside that that's not the case. We say all men are born equal, but then some people can actually dunk a basketball and other people can't.
Right.
Some people
Right.
can are great at math and other people aren't. There are differences between us, and we have to recognize, discriminate. There's another word that we
Mm-hmm.
have lost an ability to think about kind of rationally. We have to discriminate and make judgments, and when we do that, we order things in hierarchies. So anyway, all that to say, we live in a cosmos that's ordered in a hierarchy. At the very top, we have the things that are truly good in and of themselves, and ultimately God. God is at the very top, and then things are kind of ordered in descending manner down. Now, human beings are made in the image of God, so in one sense we really are equal, but in another sense, as we order our society, there are people who have certain gifts and other people who have different gifts, and those gifts are often biological in character.
Mm-hmm.
There is the gift of manhood, the gift of womanhood, and these gifts are intended to be used to build each other up, not in a kind of competitive, sort of antagonistic spirit at each other, but intended
Yes.
to work together. So that's the framework. And in antiquity, all this was common sense. I mean, among pagans and Christians and Jews, everybody understood we live in a cosmos. The question wasn't so much, is the cosmos ordered vertically, but who's on top? That was the
Right.
big question. That was a big question, because who's on top is the one who determines how the rest of the cosmos is supposed to be ordered and work.
Mhm.
And that was the big debate between Christians and pagans in the empire. Pagans said Caesar's on top, and Christians said no, Jesus is Lord. Jesus is on top, Christ.
Mhm.
And so that was the point at which there was conflict. But anyways, the cosmos is what we live in, and and whether we're in touch with it or not will determine how we live our lives and how well we'll live our lives. But I guess I should add one more thing at this point. Even though we live in a world that is kind of living sort of um, in rebellion to this way of thinking, we still live in a cosmos and we order our lives by it. So, because we believe that the cosmos is just a kind of a chaotic sort of set of collisions that have led to
Materialism.
materialism, we consequently order our lives that way. And that's why so many people are messed up in the ways that modern people get messed up. Now, people in the past were messed up too.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
there are particularly modern ways to be messed up. And they have to do, in part, with how we think about reality and the universe we live in.
So let's talk about this vertical dimension a little bit. I remember you talking about that there's no up in the cosmos. It's all just level and flat, and one set of things is equal, and there's no greater than anything else. But the our lives, our experience of reality loses quite a bit with nothing to look up to,
Right.
besides the state, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's become kind of the only thing that we can recognize as having, legitimate authority.
Mm-hmm.
The state. We look to the state to order our lives because we're afraid of the consequences if the state wasn't there. And also, we think that the state kind of imposes order on things, on a sort of chaotic, sort of meaningless set of things. The
Mm-hmm.
state superimposes meaning on things. So I think there really is a religious dimension to secularism. Secularists are blind to it,
Mm-hmm.
but they behave in a very pious way with regard to the dictates of the state.
Mm-hmm.
They think we should just all go along all the time. And that was evident really in a significant way during the pandemic. There were just some people that kind of freakishly, devoted to the rules that are being handed down from on high.
Still.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that actually that raises a question that I've kind of had in my mind. Is that when the pandemic was going on, you had a lot of people who they did say pledge fealty or pledge allegiance to the state and its media, scientific, propaganda arms, whatever the dictates came from, whatever three letter agencies. That's what we're doing, and that's the highest authority. Meanwhile, you had people who were of faith, various kinds of faith, but primarily of Christians, saying like, no, our loyalty, our allegiance is to Christ, and I was one of those. And but Christ didn't really hand out too much information about disease, right?
right,
So
right,
it
right.
seemed like, I mean, we're completely aligned. But so I sometimes in my own mind had trouble squaring that. Like, yes, there are these terrestrial authorities that say these things are going on, but I'm not going to just listen to them at a default. I'm going to listen to what I consider to be the authority, but the authority doesn't make comments on everyday headlines in that
Yeah,
way, or at
yeah,
least my experience. So maybe
sure.
you could square that circle.
Yeah, well, squaring circles is tough.
Right. Square the triangle, maybe.
Well, anyway, I'm with you. I mean, uh, I'm like 1 degree removed from both Fauci and Francis Collins. I know people who know them both, and apparently they're decent people. I mean, they're not like people sitting, in some like, room trying to figure out ways to take over the world.
Yeah,
they,
steepling their fingers.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're trying their best, but at the same time, there are certain boundaries that we should be pretty careful don't get crossed.
Mm.
And I think that was one of the things that concerned me. There was a kind of, I guess, there was just too much deference
Yeah.
to kind of the state of the science at the moment. And anyone who has any background in the sciences knows that the science is something that's sort of in process.
Right.
It's something that's being developed, and we should be anyway, willing to revisit things that we think we know when we have new data. That seemed to be thrown out the window, or at least it seemed to be that we weren't willing to concede that. And I think it was partly because they were afraid that things would just kind of like break down and there'd be chaos.
Right.
But so you ended up with this situation where kind of the administrative state was trying to sound more sure than it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then now everything's kind of coming out, and we're saying, well, you think that you sort of strengthened your authority. You actually weakened it
Mm-hmm.
through this whole thing. So now I think many people are like, you fooled me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I mean, I think
Right.
there's a lot of that right now. I certainly feel that way. After about 6 weeks, I smelled a rat,
Right.
back in 2020. Yeah, I think that this need for, an infallible authority is kind of scripted into us. Uh,
Mm.
but that infallible authority is God.
Yes.
And we don't always know what God wants. Sometimes his will is hard to discern. But at least we should be able to say that in human affairs, everything should be qualified. We should be able to say, as best as you know, this is the best course of action as far as you can tell. Okay, say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Yeah, the authoritarian angle of this cannot be questioned. You'll be censored if you ask questions, or canceled, or whatever. Sort of reflects that no, it's an attempt to impose ultimate authority on people when all it does is just kind of reveal that the emperor has no clothes. Like, if your position is so unassailable that I can't even question it, maybe there are some problems with your position that I'm not supposed to ask about.
Right. And I think that's what we're learning.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned another word in one of your answers that I wanted to touch on as well before we move on to the notion of a household. You talked about piety,
Right.
and Jonathan West, who introduced us, said that one of his favorite talks of yours, which I haven't gotten a chance to listen to, but which I'll link in the show notes, was "Make Men Pious Again." And so I'm curious to hear more from you about that, because that was also one of the chapters of the book, particularly in the beginning, that was like really touched on something that I think really resonates with so many men, related to what are their responsibilities to their fathers, to their lineages, and to their children, and to their grandchildren. And that's summed up in this word that we don't really have anymore, which is piety. And it goes beyond that as well.
Yeah. Well, that talk was originally written for a conference, and that was a really great event that I was honored to participate in. And the talk centered on the Aeneid, believe it or not, and
Mm-hmm.
how the Aeneid can be understood, or should be understood. So, if the listeners aren't familiar with the Aeneid is essentially Virgil's great epic poem about the origins of the Roman people.
Mm-hmm.
It's written in the spirit of Homer,
Mm-hmm.
and the Odyssey and the Iliad and all that. And what you have is kind of a recapitulation of the Odyssey. And what occurs in the story is, and this is something that I think most people don't know, the Romans believed that they were descended from the Trojans.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Trojan War with the big wooden horse and the Greeks and the Trojans and all that. Anyway, so, the Romans really believed that they were descended from the Trojans. And so when the Romans actually conquered, the Greek city states, it was sort of like payback in their minds. It
Mm-hmm.
was, we that's lost on us. But
The nuance.
yeah. But anyway, so the principal character in the Aeneid is Aeneas, and he is a demigod. So that means that he's got one parent's a human being, and the other parent is a Greek god or a
Mm-hmm.
Roman god. So in his case, it's his mother who's the goddess, and it's Venus. Can you imagine
Mm-hmm.
that? Just
Yeah,
imagine if Venus was your mother. Anyways,
it's a lot.
yeah. So she loves her boy,
Mm-hmm.
and she wants him to survive, and she wants him to be great. And so the story opens in the Aeneid where Aeneas is in Troy. The Trojan horse has already been brought into the city. The
Right.
city is now in flames. There's fighting in the streets, and it's pretty clear that the Trojans are going to lose the fight. And at that point in the story, his mother, Venus, appears to him and tells him to pack up and head out.
Mm.
And so he goes home, and his father, Anchises, is a cripple. Maybe that's what happens to you when you have a relationship with Venus. So you can't.
Yeah, you're not going to
Wipe,
get that for free.
yeah, you're wiped out, baby.
Yeah,
So anyway,
exactly.
so his father is a cripple. He's bedridden, and his father says, "Nope, not leaving, not leaving." Anyways, at this
Mm.
point, uh, Aeneas's wife and son enter the room, and there's this really touching scene where his wife is begging him to save them and save their son. And at that moment, there is this sign that appears, and it's a flaming crown appears on his son's head. Ilius is the name of the boy,
Mhm.
and so he realizes that this is an indication that his son is going to become a great king. And so
Mm.
he at that point says, "Well, we got to go." And his father Anchises asks for another sign. There's like a thunderclap and a meteor flashes across the sky, and he's like, "Okay, yeah, Jupiter's favored us. It's time to
Yeah,
go."
that'll
So
work.
yeah, so what happens is that Aeneas and his like moniker in the whole story is Pious Aeneas. So
Mhm.
Pious
Mm.
Aeneas takes his father and puts him on his back, and then takes his son Ilius by the hand, and then in his other hand he's got a sword, and he literally leads them out that way, leads them out of the city. And later, much later, during the days of the Republic and the Empire, the Romans would put that image on their coins.
Mhm.
And the coin, and what is intended to say is that this is the responsibility, that a man has to care for his ancestors, his father, and to honor those who went before him, and to care for those to whom he's handing over his estate, his
Mm.
son, and that's piety. So piety in the first century, and this was something that Romans, Greeks, Jews, everyone agreed on, was doing your duty. It
Mhm.
meant recognizing your benefactors, obviously your parents, your civil authorities, but most supremely the gods or God.
Mm.
And so it was not like an emotional thing necessarily. Like today, when we talk about piety, we sometimes, I think, if we're familiar with the term, think of like a little old lady, maybe with her devotional literature,
Yep.
praying. It's not that's pious, but
Mhm.
for a Roman, it could be a very manly virtue. It
Mhm.
meant fighting for your family. So piety was fighting. It included everything. It included working for a living. It included paying your respects to your elders. It included, making sacrifices to the gods. It included fighting for your family and for your city. All of that was
Mhm.
piety because the controlling sort of concept was do your duty. That was the thing.
So how does that translate then? Because there's a bunch of different pieces where I can see how that would fit, obviously, into Christianity, into a Christian framework with, God the Father and being piety and being pious, towards our lineages. Well, actually, let's start with towards our personal lineages, because I think one of the things that this generation of men and possibly the previous generation as well is really struggling with is I think that somewhere along the line in the middle of the 20th century, the chain got broken.
Right.
And so a lot of men are disconnected from their fathers. Maybe they had stepfathers, or maybe they had distant, absent fathers. What was it? I listened to the Canon Press Father Hunger talk,
Hmm.
and I think it was Tim Bailey talked about absent fathers, abdicated fathers, and abusive fathers,
Right.
and that seems to kind of be the thing. Like the men that I speak to, very few of them have a father that wasn't one of those three things, at least one of those three things. So, in the spirit of piety, with men honoring their fathers, what if their fathers were dishonorable men, and then that chain has been broken from their past? They don't even know who their grandfathers were potentially.
Yeah, I think that's a very important observation, and that's certainly the case for me as well.
Mm,
So,
that's right.
I think the thing to do in that respect is to see yourself as the beginning of a new line. For one thing, I think
Hmm.
you should. you should still, pay your respects as best you can without lying,
Sure.
you know. But at the same time, I think you should kind of see yourself maybe in the spirit of Abraham. So, like with the story of Abraham, you have a man who is told to leave his father's household, and from that point on, whenever God identifies himself, he begins with Abraham. He doesn't begin with Terah, his father. He begins with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so on.
Mm.
So a household can have a founder, and in the case of Aeneas, he is founder of a new house. Even though he had a father that he loved and respected, he's starting a new thing. And so I think we can think of it in those terms. We can see ourselves as a new beginning.
Hmm. Okay, so the opportunity to kind of break from the past and say, what's done is done, and to still perhaps embody the best of what we sense may have come from our genetic lineage, and start fresh as much as we can.
Right. I think that's the thing that we have to do, because we don't want to find ourselves uh, papering over things or lying about things that were actually pretty bad.
Hmm. Hmm. So then, how do we extend this notion of piety? Let's connect it to God now as well, because in the Romans they were talking about perhaps ancestor worship and the gods. So we also need, and if we're talking as men today, reconnecting with our past or starting fresh and building a new house. What does it look for men today? Because I know many men are coming to the Christian faith, which is something that I've been a part of in the past couple of years as well. What does it look like to be pious in a Christian sense, also being willing to fight? Because that's a question that I hear many men asking.
Yeah, I think that the Greek word that we find in the New Testament is eusebio, and it means exactly the same thing as pious in the Latin. So we're actually called to this. So we were told, of course, in Scripture to honor our father and mother. Now, that can be a father and mother in the faith as well. Paul referred to himself as a father to Timothy. And I think that there's a kind of piety that we can exercise when it comes to our spiritual parents, those who have
Hmm.
been important to us. But I think too that ultimately all good things come from God.
Hmm.
So we of course reject the gods of antiquity, but what we do is when we do that is we don't leave it empty. We recognize the true God and express our gratitude to Him. Then there's when it comes to this matter of fighting for our families. There's a I think set of realities that kind of are again kind of layered. um,
Hmm.
the physical fight can be part of this. We should be in a position to defend our families physically if we need to do so. But there's an ongoing fight that's spiritual in character as well. So we should see ourselves as warriors, serving our families through the spiritual conflict that we find ourselves in. And we certainly are surrounded by hostile forces in every sort of sphere of life.
Yes. So maybe we can touch a little bit on this notion of servant leadership, and how that's kind of a little inverted, I think, from what the picture you're portraying.
Yeah, I think that leadership is leadership.
Right.
In the sense that a leader says this is the way we're going, this is what we need to do, and that kind of thing. It's taking responsibility. Now in terms of am I serving people through my leadership? Of course,
Yes.
but it doesn't mean that I'm sitting around with my wringing my hands saying, "What do you want me to do?" I'm exercising some leadership by thinking and being proactive and taking action and doing the things that are going to be in the best interest of the family. I think that what some of the people who have been advocates of quote servant leadership had in mind that was actually something that's worth considering is that sometimes leadership can be exercised in a selfish way. So
Right.
if it's all about your ego and your ego trip, then yeah, that's not a good thing. But I think that when you exercise leadership in a way that's uh, truly in the interest of everyone in under your care, then they'll recognize your authority as legitimate and
Hmm.
not call it into question. Now they might
Hmm.
call into question your judgments every once in a while if they think that maybe a better course of action would have been something different. But at least from the standpoint of the moral outlook, your leadership is not being questioned. You're trying to exercise leadership in a way that benefits everyone under the household
Mhm.
shelter. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind. And sometimes it, you don't have time to explain yourself. You just say, just do what I said.
Right.
we gotta get this thing done. Other times, you can explain, and it's always good if you can do that, particularly if you're trying to raise kids or that are you know going to be intelligent and exercise judgment themselves well someday. And then in your wife, you want to be um, understood by your wife and why you're making the choices that you're making.
Yeah, and that's a notion of childhood piety as well. As if you are not lucky enough or blessed enough to have a father who was in your life, or who had a noble presence in your life, let's say. Well, if you exercise noble authority, and hold the right spirit of being a leader and a servant in your leadership, you can set the example for that house to come and give your children something to be pious towards, perhaps.
Yeah, my kids are all grown and they're very respectful to me. I have great relationships with them, and they're all doing great. And so I'm very happy for them. And, the relationships are strong. Um, and, I'm very grateful for that. Um, and it's certainly different than, what I witnessed in my own childhood.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about that, so that I can make sure to communicate it accurately, or you can communicate it yourself. Just a bit about your background, because it is actually quite interesting how you came to faith, and certainly many men I think would relate to your upbringing and the ABC upbringing. And I'll let you share what that acronym means.
Well, sure. I mean, I was pretty much on my own from the time I was about 11 years old. My father was out of the picture at that point, uh, and then even before that, the influence was not all that good. He was a Scientologist, and my mother was in and out of mental institutions. That was kind of into sort of. Um, she was addicted to various psychotropic drugs, and but anyway, so I was ward of the state for a period of time, pretty much on my own, like I said. And it was through the influence of a friend whose father was a pastor that I came into the Christian faith. And through that little blue collar church that my friend's father pastored, there were a lot of people I got to see who were just blue collar, kind of salt of the earth people, kind of very Norman Rockwell kind of world that was very different than the world that I had known up to that point. And so they were, they were examples to me, and of how to live like a man, and uh, you know, do so in a way that benefited the women and the children in their lives. So that was how I came to kind of see things differently than I would have seen it if it hadn't been for that church and the conversion that I experienced when I was a teenager.
Hmm. Yeah, and the ABC acronym stands
Yeah,
for
yeah.
anything but Christian.
Yeah,
Yeah,
anything but Christianity. That was my pretty much my father. Yeah, right.
yeah, exactly. Well, so as you I want to get to the notion of households, but I'm actually really interested. So you were introduced to the faith through this house that you were a part of, essentially. What was the journey like becoming a pastor and a writer? I mean, you must be no more surprised than almost anyone to see where you've ended up, in a sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't have any aspirations to pastoral ministry. It was something I didn't want to be involved with at all. I had a desire to be actually a comic book artist, and that was my dream, and I pursued it. And so I was resistant to any kind of pastoral or ministry kind of vocation. And so I fought that. I actually think that that's a pretty good sign that you may be called to ministry. It's the people who are eager to do the job that either don't understand the nature of the work or shouldn't be trusted in it. And you think about the people in Scripture, that none of them wanted the job. But anyway, you have that was kind of the world I came out of. And but I mean, I'm very glad to be involved in ministry now. But I've done other things. I've been a landlord and a college professor. I taught philosophy for years, and I've also done some building, contracting. I've been a contractor. So I've had a range of experiences and been very grateful for the range of experiences. But writing, if you'd asked me even as a kid, can you ever imagine yourself writing a book? I said, I can't even read a book. I, I wasn't a reader. I don't think I finished my first book, if, it's all the way, in terms of like, anything more than a children's picture book until I was, well into my teen years. And I was very proud of myself when I finally finished a book. But
Oh,
I didn't,
congratulations.
yeah, I didn't like English. I wasn't any good at it. And I didn't have any interest in writing at all. And it wasn't until I was actually in my first graduate program that I entertained the idea that maybe I could write. And I had some experiences writing that were great in the sense that everything I wrote ended up being published. It was one of those weird things where, like,
Wow.
again, I didn't want the job, and then it kind of
Exactly.
goes well.
Yeah, that's sort of that's a surprising thing. Is like most people who write, they feel called to it, but it's a painful process every step of the way. It's like, this is not something that I would choose for myself, but I can't not do it.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, for me, inertia is the biggest thing to get over every time. So, like when I get up in the morning, I find it much more pleasant to read somebody else's book than to write my own. Writing my own book is a lot of work, and making yourself, actually put the pen to the paper and start writing things out. That it usually takes me about 15 minutes to half an hour to really finally get into the groove
Yeah.
when I get going.
Do you have like a particular process? I'm always curious about writers' processes, if they have rituals or whatever they do to get themselves into the space of writing.
Well, I do. I mean, I try to set aside the mornings for my intellectual work. I never eat anything before lunch. I have a couple of cups of black coffee, and that's it. And then I get into it. And the thing I have to get over is I usually pick up a book that's fairly challenging to read, and then the challenge is to put it down and start writing.
Yes. One more chapter. Just one more chapter.
That's pretty much it. Yeah, I was like, okay, I got to get it right. So then I start writing, and then when I try to write 5 handwritten pages a day. So like when I'm working on a book or something like that. Then if I feel like I've hit my goal, reached my goal, then I can put the pen down and not feel any guilt, no remorse, no. I, Even if it's really rotten, terrible writing, I'll just say it's done. And then after I get the first draft done, then I go back and rework it. I'm like a 10 draft guy. There are some guys who are like one draft, two draft guys. So some of my friends, they just put out so much stuff. Like you mentioned, Doug Wilson. Doug's a friend of mine. I asked Doug one time. I said, "How many books do you work on at any given time?"
Yes. All of them.
5. He has 5 books going on at any given time. And I was
Wow.
like, I'm 1 or 2 book at the time kind of guy. And
Yeah.
I remember another good time. Tony Eslin's a friend of mine. He wrote, in fact, he wrote something I think for the preface or the introduction to.
He did. Yeah.
And I asked him. I said, you're just amazing, Tony. I mean, how much? Are you like a 1 draft guy? He said, no, I'm a 2 draft guy. I said, I'm like a 10 draft guy.
Right.
I'm never happy with what I've written, even after it's been published. If I pick up a book that I wrote, a couple years ago and I read it, I say, oh man, I should have put it this way. Okay. Anyway,
Isn't
so
that
that's
how
me.
it,
That's me.
isn't that how it always is? We go back to our earlier work and cringe, like, oh, how could I
Yeah.
thought it was so good at the time.
Yeah. Well, even then I didn't feel like it was all that great. But by the time I'm like at a point where I feel like I'm ready to let it alone, I'm so tired of it. I don't even
Right.
want to pick it up anymore and look at it. I'm like, I'm done. I'm done.
Yeah, exactly. Just I'm ready to move on from it. I've put as much energy as I can into it. I have to let it go. I have to ship it, as they say.
Right. Right.
Your 2 books, you've got Man of the House and Household and the War of the Cosmos. You talk about this notion of the productive household. And so I want to talk about that because I had parallel thoughts, let's say, that one of the great backwards blessings, I guess you might say, of COVID is that it drove everyone back into their homes and recreated the notion of like, we don't have to commute to go to an office anymore. We can actually be home with our family. And there's something very powerful about that, rediscovering the way life was before the Industrial Revolution. And so I had put those pieces together going back to like the 1850s or something like that, that the home used to be the center of economic production. But then you linked it to something far deeper, taking place during the biblical era, which I think was more profound and important, and that I think has real lessons for us today, which is the nature of those two books.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a kind of a practical dimension to things, and I talk about that in that book, "The Man of the House," and then I try to tie it to where I make the connection to the cosmos, or the larger reality, in the second book, "The Household and War for the Cosmos." I felt like I needed to do that to help people realize that it's important to fight for the household, even though we may find ourselves in a world where we don't have to make our households productive. We can actually live, in what I call the recreational household, where it's just basically a home entertainment center. You do all your productive work someplace else, and then you come home and crash. And that's what house is for. It's just watching television or Netflix and surfing the web and eating Chinese food, that's been delivered, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So,
Well, so in this, but the household can have far greater significance than I think most men are accustomed to experiencing it.
yeah, well, in antiquity, it was understood to be kind of the basic building block of a civilization, and it still is. The problem that we have is that we live in a world that's lost touch with it, and on its in terms of its meaning, and even in terms of its sort of usefulness, and consequently, we have a lot of social pathologies that we're dealing with
Mm-hmm.
in our world, and we'll have to recover it at some point,
Right.
if we're going to have a healthy civilization. Um, the alternative is just unhuman. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that communism is an attempt to create a world without the household. I think that what we see in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is sort of a
Yep.
capitalist approach to how you can have a civilization without a household. But in both the cases, we think about like 1984 and Brave New World. Who would really want to live in those places? Um, they're ugly, and but we can see how the institutions of the modern world encourage us in those directions. So you have to fight to resist those forces, and to preserve the household, even against the well-meaning efforts of people who don't understand what households are for.
So, what are households for?
Well, I think households are the first institution, and
Mm-hmm.
they are established by God. So what we see in the Garden of Eden in Scripture is the establishment of the first household, and individualism is fruitless in not just the sense that Adam was fruitless without a wife, in the sense of not having children, but
Mm-hmm.
fruitless in the sense that um, we are designed to by God to have these deep binding commitments to one another, to carry us through life, and when they are working the right way, these relationships, husband, wife, children, parents, we're fruitful in ways that we cannot be, as individuals. That's why,
Mm-hmm.
we see in Scripture, it was not good that the man was alone.
Mm-hmm.
We're made for that, and it's in that in the relationship of that the relationships we know in a household can't be, you can't substitute like your work relationships for it,
Mm-hmm.
for those things. Um, I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather. I'm not just an individual.
Mm-hmm.
My self understanding situates me in a family, in a household, and I think that that's true for everybody. And when we try to, when we move away from that, like we are attempting to do in popular culture today, we end up with just lots of damaged people.
Mm-hmm. People's households, men and women, like you say, it was an entertainment center, recreation center, or a war zone potentially. If it doesn't go well, go ahead.
Yeah, or just a place where you're all by yourself,
Right.
or you're living in some kind of fantasy world where you're experimenting on your own body and cutting things off and adding things. It's just
Mm-hmm.
nuts.
Mm-hmm. How can reestablishing the household provide a bulwark against some of the worst excesses of communism, neo-Marxism, globalism? Like, why does it actually begin in the household?
Well, like I said, it's the first institution, and so authority is understood to be legitimate in a household because of the way in which love uh, informs it. So, the relationship that I have with my children, when those relationships are ordered properly, I am a father, and consequently I have authority, but I'm not just an authority figure in some kind of abstract sense. I'm physically connected to my children, and I love them, and they love me, and that informs sort of the function that we see in a household. And so, every other institution in society is in some sense derivative of this. So, like when we think about the fathers of the community, we think about like the founding fathers. We refer to them as fathers, you know, because there's some sense in which they are deriving their role in the larger community from the legitimacy of the father's role in his home. We could talk about mothers in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So, when a woman is a mother to sort of like all and everyone who comes around her. My wife is that sort of woman. She's just a mother wherever she is,
Mm-hmm.
and people, acknowledge her, not only her love and care, but her authority. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
coercive authority; it's a moral authority,
Mm-hmm.
um, and consequently, people listen to her. They take her advice. It doesn't mean that they always do what she says or she advises, but they can't take her advice lightly. They
Mm-hmm.
can't just dismiss it because they know that she cares about them and that she's actually doing what she can that is in the best interest of the people she's talking to, even though she's not physically their mother.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so all of when the household breaks down, it has kind of a set of unforeseen consequences throughout society.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Michael Foster, his new book, It's Good to Be a Man, he talks about gravitas.
Yeah.
And as you're talking about the moral authority of you as a father and your wife as a mother, I can't help but connect it to some notion of gravitas, which I also can't help to connect to some notion of piety as well. That that part of a man's gravitas does have to do with his connection to something beyond himself. Maybe not necessarily his lineage, but something that he serves beyond himself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if it's just about me, uh, and it's just the fact that I'm bigger and stronger than you are, well, then you're going to, maybe do what I say, but just because you have to, not because there's any kind of moral claim that I represent. And it's not me. I'm not representing me. I'm representing something bigger than myself. So, like when it comes to like the work of a father saying disciplining his children, if the kids think it's just about your ego, they may do what you want, but as soon as they're out of the house, forget it. But if they know that you are a subject to a higher authority yourself, and that you're trying to represent the truth, um, in all of its painful implications sometimes, then there's a sense in which, okay, it's not about him. It's just about what's right and what's wrong. And that's why it's also really important for, say, an authority figure like a father or a mother, when they are in the wrong, to note it and to say, hey, I was wrong about that. Please forgive me. That doesn't undermine your authority. It actually further strengthens it. Unless you're like a real dope and you keep doing
Right.
it.
Totally different.
Yeah, eventually they're like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
But and if you're sincere and you're trying your best and you're improving, then your kids will, I think most of the time, uh, receive that well.
Now let's connect this now to the cosmos. So the first institution, and we're talking about higher notions of truth. How does a well-ordered household um, contribute in the war for the cosmos.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that's one of the things that the Apostle Paul is addressing in Ephesians. So we shy away from the household codes today because they're politically incorrect, and certainly we don't need to bring back slavery. I'm not saying that we need that in
That's
order to
not
fulfill the household codes,
right.
but nevertheless, there is a sense in which husbands and wives reflect a larger order, and that larger order, Paul tells us, is Christ and the church. So a husband represents Christ. He's not Christ. The wife knows that.
Right.
Everybody knows that.
She'll find out pretty quick if she thinks otherwise.
That's right. But you're playing a role. And likewise, the wife has a role, and she's not the church, obviously. And in another sense, she is, but so am I. but she's representing the church. And so, in a sense, we're playing out in miniature the story of the world. And that means that, there's a certain scriptedness to things. Now, we have a lot of freedom within that framework to kind of play our roles. When we think about, say, roles in like a film or in a play, different actors and actresses can take the roles and give them, something of their own character, but at the same time, it's pretty obvious they're playing a role. So there's a way that I play the role. There's the way you play the role. There's a way your wife plays a role or my wife plays a role. And that's fine. That's great. But in the same sense, it's not like we're making it up as we go along. There are these roles that we're reflecting. And it's scripted into the nature of things. So we're, biologically and even eschatologically, in the sense of the future of the human race, there's a sense in which we are embodying something in the present moment that's a much bigger story than ourselves.
So what we're experiencing in some sense as discovery is really a rediscovery. It's
Yeah,
always there.
that's right. That's right. So, it's like when we think about the fact that Christ is Lord, we don't make him Lord. He is Lord. What we do is recognize his lordship. We say, oh, of course, I need to submit to him. And in the same way, it's not as though when we follow these household codes, we're creating something. It's just we're kind of representing it to the world. And it should be something beautiful. When people see it and it's working right, people should admire it and should appreciate it and want to enter into the same thing themselves.
Now these are the household codes as articulated by Paul, or our own individual household codes, or perhaps both.
Well, I think both. I mean, there are going to be some things that are going to characterize your house and versus my house, but there are things that we have in common. So, like there's a role for husbands, there's a role for wives, and that kind of thing. And how they get worked out in particular situations is going to, kind of depend on the people involved. So
Right.
I was having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day who's an elder in my church, and we were just talking about our wives, and one of the things that we both kind of noted is that um, we probably shouldn't have our wives be our administrative assistants.
Probably not.
Probably,
No.
because there's a sense in which even though they may want to do that, there's a sense in which maybe someone else would be a better person for that thing. And like, for example, I don't want to, be, sort of laying in bed and having my wife go through the list of things to do tomorrow.
Right.
I just want to go to bed.
That's right.
But and then there are situations where, like in our case, we've got a few different businesses that we run out of our home, and my wife has her own business that she has, and I'm supportive and so forth, but I'm very happy for her to do her thing.
Sure. So, as a pastor, you minister to a lot of individuals, men and women, but particularly for men. A lot of men have been waking up over the course of the past couple of years, let's say, and recognizing that things are not right in their world, they're not right in their nation, they're not right in their households, not to mention their bodies. So, what we're describing in terms of the war of the cosmos is coming back into alignment with what is. But if you're already a husband and already a father, already with a running household, for better or worse, it's a giant process to come back into alignment if you're already far out of alignment. If your children, for example, are estranged or your wife is distant, it can be a very big ask, and yet that is the ask. What sort of advice do you give to men to begin this journey of bringing things back into alignment, particularly if they're the only ones in the household that want to take things in that direction?
Yeah, that's a great question and an important one to think about and address. I think the first thing is to get your own house in order. And what I mean by that is your own interior house, your inner life. Getting yourself into a place where, uh, your own sort of the components of your own your own self are aligned appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, one of the big things would be self mastery. If you can acquire uh, a greater degree of self control and self mastery, if you can expand your competency into new areas, those things cannot but produce a greater or higher regard for you with other people. So if you know how to do things, people have to respect that, particularly if those things that you know how to do are things they need done. you know.
Yes, sure.
So, and of course, when you find yourself in a position where you have these skills and you are in a position to help other people, then they're in a position, then you can do that for other people, and then in return, they can hopefully respond the right way. But if you can keep your head, keep your cool in difficult situations, if you can order your own sort of immediate behavior in ways that are conducive to being respected and conducive to getting things done, then I think that you can make progress in the other things, these external things that have to do with your relationship with people that perhaps are not in the best place at the moment. So hopefully you can find yourself in a position to command the respect of those people. Now, commanding respect doesn't mean respect me. That's one of the quickest ways to lose respect, in fact.
That's right.
What I mean is by the conduct of your life, people can't help but respect you. It may take a while for them to really believe it, particularly if you have a bad track record. But hopefully, over time, you can overcome uh, the things that you've done in the past that would make it difficult to respect you. But once you find yourself in a position where you uh, are even able to deal with the fact that maybe people are resistant or reluctant to respect you in a way that they can't help but respect, you get my drift.
Mm-hmm.
Then,
Yeah.
then you're making progress, and
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully, in time, you'll find yourself in a position where you're able to see the household that you are charged with caring for and leading reflect that inner state that you've been working on, like with God's help, of course.
Of course, of course. Well, I want to get to your book about Tom Bombadil, but before we do, I just had one question because I have a lot of women listeners as well, and we're in this peculiar moment where we just talked about men bringing their households into alignment, but we're in this peculiar moment where many women have woken up before their husbands or their boyfriends even, and are the ones out there like saying, "No, this is not right." What advice do you give to women to perhaps lead their husbands along to into this, because it can come from either direction? What do women say to you, and what do you say to them, like how to get their husbands to, I guess you'd say, step up?
Yeah, I think the prayer life of a godly wife is remarkably effective, or can be. And if she simply takes her concern for her husband to the Lord on an ongoing basis, He's going to pick up on that. She doesn't need to say anything, but often, just by how she responds to maybe um, you know, his sinfulness, frankly, can do a lot to help a man see himself at the way he ought to. What we want to see happen is not just simply have. We don't simply want a situation in which an accusation is being made and the guy gets on the defensive. That's not going to take you where you want to go. But if you could find yourself in a situation where this guy is just ashamed of himself, I mean, just ashamed of his way he's conducted himself and how he's treated people, you're at the brink of something that could be wonderful. Um, and what I think a wife ought to be praying for, or a girlfriend ought to be praying for, is that. And then there's a sense in which this is a difficult thing to do, really difficult thing to do, to treat him with a measure of regard that he doesn't deserve. You know, because there are a lot of jerks out there,
Yeah.
and sometimes we've been jerks. And and my wife is remarkably gifted in this regard, and has been a great help to me at certain points. Like when I hurt my wife's feelings, I feel terrible.
Of course.
I feel like, man, I am a real jerk.
Hmm.
That kind of thing. And that's where you want your husband to be, sort of able to
Right.
to accuse himself. How could I be so thoughtless? How could I do something as uh, as wrong as that?
Hmm.
And if that occurs, he's not far from the kingdom.
Hmm. Well, there's a certain degree of mercy, right? Like husbands are often told to show, men are told to show mercy to those around them. It's not a popular word, but that's the sentiment.
Sure.
But there can also be a degree of mercy shown to men, like we're not going to be perfect,
Right.
and certainly to be ridiculed or to be shamed or to be iced out or whatever, by the woman we love. That's not necessarily going to be effective, and so there's got to be a degree of grace allotted to men for their imperfections and their sinfulness.
Right. Right. Yeah. Sometimes guys can be hardcore jerks. And I'm not saying that that's not the case. But I am thinking about the situations that I have seen in which a man has repented and given himself to shaping up, and it's usually not through nagging, or haranguing or that kind of stuff. It's usually because the guy genuinely feels ashamed of himself.
Hmm. Yeah, and these are good men.
Hmm.
Obviously, there are not good men out there for whom grace is extended
Yeah.
and let's say overextended. But for
Right.
the average man, who's just trying, I
Hmm.
think that I think that extending them grace is very important.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. The Apostle Paul talks about heaping coals upon the head,
Hmm.
of people when you don't return in kind, some wrong for wrong. Um,
Hmm.
so I think that what's going on there. Well, what's being triggered in the best sense is the conscience of that person. We're
Hmm.
made in the image of God. That means that we possess within ourselves a knowledge of right and wrong, um, and what we want to see in people is uh, a recognition of the right, what is right, and a recognition of being in the wrong, and that it's not
Hmm.
just an exterior sort of thing that is being impinged upon them, but it's an actual inner, recognition that I'm in the wrong. I need to change.
Hmm. And some degree of mutuality when it's necessary as well, so
Right.
that neither partner is bending the knee to the other. That there are circumstances where it's like, no, we were both wrong, and we'll step into the space of reconciliation together.
Yeah. Yep. That's great.
So just before we wrap up, I did want to ask you about your new book about Tom Bombadil, because I have
Yeah.
many friends and listeners who are huge fans of Lord of the Rings, and that seems to be the one episode of the books anyway that raises the most questions. So
Right.
I haven't
Right.
read the book, but I'm curious about your thesis and whatever you'd like to say about it.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to. I mean, I think that Tom Bombadil is an underappreciated character. Obviously, that's the case since I wrote a book about him. But the question is what function does Tom have in the story? A lot of people don't know how he could possibly serve a purpose, but Tolkien himself in a letter said he did. He said the reason I left him in the story is because he serves a purpose, and so that forced me to think, what could that purpose possibly be? And I think one of the things we see in Lord of the Rings is a sort of an exploration of the sin of domination, and in contrast to the sort of the calling to exercise dominion. So Like when we think about dominion, I think a lot of people think it's just a synonym for domination, but it's not. Domination is what a Hitler does or a Stalin, someone like that. Dominion is what we see with Christ. So there's a distinction here that needs to be made. And I think in the Lord of the Rings, when we look at Tom, we have a picture of what true dominion looks like. And we can contrast that with the wicked characters in the story, Saruman, those characters, and how they endeavored to control everything around them. Genuine dominion is something that is exercised in communion with the people that are under your authority. Control is different, So I set up a couple of contrasts. One is between dominion and domination, and the other is between communion and control. So the dominator controls but doesn't commune. The one who exercises dominion is in communion with the ones that are subject to him.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about, I had someone on my podcast a long time ago, Zach Small, who talked about the difference between dominant and domineering. And so you have dominion, dominant, domineering, and right. But they all go back to the same root, which is dome or domus, which is house, which is what we're talking about.
Right, exactly right.
So just real quick, how does Tom Bombadil exercise dominion, or should I buy the book and find out by reading it?
Well, I'm fine with talking about it because, the two episodes that we see dominion being exercised by Tom are, most clearly that when he saves the hobbits from Old Man Willow, the wicked, willow tree that tries to consume the hobbits, when he comes on the scene, Merry and Pippin are inside the tree, and then at the Barrow-wight episode where we see the Barrow-wight, which is like a wicked ghost who has the hobbits in the barrow, which is a tomb, and he's about to kill them. And at that point in the story, Tom comes to the rescue again. So in both episodes, Tom exercises authority. In the first case, he exercises authority over the tree. And in the second case, he exercises authority over the Barrow-wight. So he's exercising dominion, but it's in the interests of the hobbits in both cases. It's not just Tom pushing people around and making them do what he wants to do.
I think what always stands out to me about that episode is just how he looks at the One Ring and just seems completely disinterested in it. Like, oh yeah, whatever.
Yeah, that's a very important point in the story, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about that in the book.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to send men towards the book for more.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chris. Where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
Well, there is a website. Everybody has a website, and it's crwiley.com. And you can find links to the books there that I've written and interviews and different things. And then there's the podcast that I'm a part of, the Theology Pugcast, PUG. And I have a couple of friends that are on that show with me, Tom Price and Glenn Sunshine. And those are probably the best places. And if a person is in the Pacific Northwest and finds himself or herself in the Portland, Oregon area, the church I serve is actually in a suburb of Portland.
Great. I'll be sure to send men your way.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. This has been outstanding.
Well, I really appreciate it, Will. Thanks for having me on the show.